Hello and welcome to everybody. My name is Gretchen Neidhart. I am the cataloging and metadata librarian at the Chicago History Museum and the moderator of tonight's program, Chicago Municipal Records, Access and Accountability. Some very brief housekeeping. As you have noted, this program is being recorded and it will be made publicly available. Our attendees are muted audibly, but the chat is open. You are welcome to submit questions for panelists at any time using the Q&A feature, and we'll get through as many as possible in the last half hour. So I would like to start tonight with Chicago History Museum's land acknowledgement, which I think is particularly important as we are discussing both the access limitations for many voluntary and involuntary residents of this area, while at the same time discussing the documentation of colonization. So I am speaking to you all tonight from the ancestral homelands of the Potawatomi people who cared for the land until forced out by non-native settlers. The Ojibwe, Odawa, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Miami, Mascoutin, Sac and Fox, Kickapoo, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and tribes whose names have been lost as a result of genocide also lived, gathered, and traded in this region. Today, Chicago is home to the largest urban indigenous population in the Midwest, and they continue to honor this land and its waterways, practice traditions, and celebrate their heritage. I furthermore want to acknowledge the contributions of indigenous communities, and I commit to an ongoing collaboration to share that complex and inclusive history. So I am personally an active participant in both of our sponsors tonight, the Chicago Area Archivists and Chicago Collections. And I'm really proud to share that tonight's program is being presented as a continued partnership between the two. A huge thank you to both groups, in particular, Jeannie Long, head of Chicago Collections, and Erin Matson, head of the steering committee of Chicago Area Archivists, and also to Chicago Area Archivists Anti-Racism Working Group, where the seed of this program started. So for those of you who are new to Chicago Collections, it's a consortium comprised of libraries, museums, and cultural heritage organizations, all working together for the preservation, promotion, and sharing of Chicago's rich history. This occurs through the sharing of member archival collections and digital images on CCC's free and open access portal, Explore Chicago Collections, and through free public programs. Please be sure to check Chicago Collections website, chicagocollections.org, for additional listings of upcoming programs, such as our conversation with Gordon Siegel about Crate and Barrel's history. Chicago Area Archivists is a local membership-based professional organization whose goals are to share information on issues of interest to the local archival community, to keep members informed about archival programs and resources, and most pertinent to this program, to advocate preservation of and access to historically valuable resources related to the Chicago area. In fact, CAA was founded in 1982 when a group of archivists got together over a concern for county and city records that were languishing in leaky warehouses and inaccessible to the public. These folks worked with the state archivists to inventory these records and promote a more centralized repository, which is what ultimately led to the IRAD facility at Northeastern Illinois University, which you'll hear more about later in our program. This was the driving force behind the creation of CAA, and nearly 40 years later, we are continuing this work, and we hope to continue to improve access to these important records. I encourage you to visit CAA's website to learn about our other events and consider joining. In fact, October is Archives Awareness Month, and as part of our annual October celebrations, we always host something called Chicago Open Archives. So at the end of the month, on October 29th, we will be hosting a virtual conference with the theme Hindsight is 2020, Lessons Learned and Steps Taken. You can find out more about this event and our other social events and also professional development events by joining our free listserv. You don't have to be a member to join the listserv, or following our social media accounts. So I'd like to introduce tonight's panelists. We have Emiliano Aguilar from Northwestern University, Lakedria Chavis from the Marshall Project, Edward Remus and Joshua Salzmann, both from Northeastern Illinois University, Sam Stecklow from the Invisible Institute and Southside Weekly, and Matt Topic from Lovie and Lovie's Freedom of Information Act practice. We convened this particular group because each works with Chicago's city records or municipal records in a different way. Access to municipal records is vital for government accountability and anti-racism. Currently, Chicago does not have a mandate to preserve municipal records beyond those that are initially public, nor does it have standardized practices or standardized policies for archiving historic municipal records, nor a centralized city archives, making the process of locating and accessing municipal records complicated and burdensome. Different departments follow different practices, which makes a global search next to impossible right now. I'm really excited to hear our panelists address their own work with city records, the limitations they have run into, and their advice and resources for tackling these barriers. We also know that this is just a starting point. There's so many aspects to municipal records that are very complicated, and we really do hope that this will be the first of many programs. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing and I am going to start posing my questions to our panelists. So I'm going to go panelist by panelist. And first, I would love to ask each of you all to briefly introduce yourself and your work a little bit more. And I'd like you to tell us how you use municipal records in your own work. So I'm going to start with Emiliano.
Sure, hi. I'm a PhD student at Northwestern University in the history department. Despite my research being based in neighboring East Chicago, Indiana, I'm trained in Chicago history. Most recently, I served as an intern at Northeastern Illinois University for the Chicago project that we'll be talking about today. And municipal records for me, I think, are a cornerstone of part of my research in dealing and talking about corruption, both like the paranoia of, oh, is this numbered page white out because there was a mistake made, or did they have to replace this at last minute? But especially during times of COVID and archives were closed, I really turned to municipal documents as an opportunity to continue research and I think explore like this untapped, very difficult bureaucratic resource for my research. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Lakedria?
Hi, I'm excited to be here. I'm a reporter with the Marshall Project. It's a nonprofit newsroom that covers criminal justice across the country. But previous to starting that job, recently I was a local reporter here in Chicago for about 5 years. So I have lots of experience looking for and using municipal records just in everyday reporting and also long-term investigative stories that I've done. And I think they're incredibly important to not just making the news run, but also having an informed public.
Thank you. Edward?
Thank you. I'm Ed Remus. I'm the social sciences librarian at Northeastern Illinois University. And I would say that in my practical day-to-day work, I bring two sets of experiences to this work. One is, on the one hand, assisting undergraduates, graduate students, and even faculty members with historical research, which can often be fairly in-depth and fine-grained. And on the other hand, partnering with the Chicago Metro History Fair to work with junior high and high school students. And I think those experiences inform the work that I'll be presenting because I always try to think about how we can make historic records discoverable and sensible both to advanced researchers, but also to beginning researchers. And that's sort of the spirit that we tried to bring to the guide we'll be presenting.
Thank you. Joshua?
Hello, my name is Joshua Salzmann. I'm a history professor at Northeastern Illinois University and one of the faculty members who Ed helps with his research projects. And my first big research project was a book I did about the environmental history of Chicago's waterfront. And I began that project as a dissertation when I was a PhD student at UIC. And the basis for that research is Chicago municipal government documents. And I'm currently also working on another second book project about the history of gun control in Chicago from the 1960s to the early 2000s. And again, the basis of that research is municipal records from Chicago. So they're essentially the bone marrow of my scholarship. So they're very important to what I do professionally.
Great. Sam?
Hi, I'm a journalist with the Invisible Institute, which is a nonprofit journalistic production company based in Woodlawn, which is kind of just a way of saying that we produce a lot of different kinds of projects across different mediums. We have traditional investigative print journalism, as well as audio and video documentaries, as well as it's probably our best known project, which is the Citizens Police Data Project, which houses a few decades worth of use of force complaint, award, and other information about every Chicago police officer that's served over that time frame. And I've also been an editor at Southside Weekly for the past 5 or 6 years as well, where we use public records all the time in a different way to tell stories about the South Side, and that includes, FOIA requests as well as archival work.
Thank you. And Matt?
Hey everyone, I'm Matt Topic. I'm a lawyer at Lovey & Lovey here in Chicago, and I run a practice that focuses on litigating cases under the Freedom of Information Act. So unfortunately, and I suspect many participants know this already, getting records out of the city of Chicago, or to be fair, many different entities, can be a challenge. They're not always cooperative. There's often long delays. There's often assertion of bases to withhold records that really aren't founded under the law. And so about 7 years ago, I left a job in sort of corporate legal practice at a large law firm to focus on what had been my pro bono work to litigate Freedom of Information Act cases. So we're now a team of 5 lawyers and 3 paralegals. We either are doing or have done over 500 of these cases, spanning from the Laquan McDonald shooting video, Rahm Emanuel's use of private email accounts. Yesterday, I argued for removal of some of the redactions to the Mueller report in a federal appeal in DC. And so I don't really work with records very much. I try to open the doors and do succeed in opening the doors to government records to others. And then I sort of sit back with great satisfaction and see the amazing things that people can do with them. So really excited to be here. I've had some archivist clients. They're among the more interesting folks and exciting things we've done, and we've done a lot of different things. So really appreciate the opportunity.
All right, thank you, Matt. So my next question, which I'll start with you actually, Matt, is what types of records have actually been the most difficult for you to access?
Let me modify that question just a little bit, but it'll make sense. It can often be which entities are the most difficult to get records from, and that will actually correspond to the kinds of records. And sort of sadly, ironically, the worst offenders of the Freedom of Information Act, and this is true in Chicago, around the state, and at the federal level, are law enforcement agencies, which is troubling. I mean, these are agencies that are tasked with upholding the law, and they frequently just don't follow it. I mean, the Chicago Police Department often just outright ignores requests, and I guess would rather be sued than turn records over. So it used to be really hard to get police dash cam and body cam, or really anything, whenever the police said they were investigating. And post Laquan McDonald, that has changed just dramatically. So the city now releases videos from fatal use of force and certain other situations within 60 to 90 days. It used to be you might wait for a really long time. Sort of the maybe other end of the spectrum is emails. I mentioned private email accounts. That's been an issue. There is an exemption called deliberative process, which says if government officials are deliberating about a matter of policy, that their opinions get to be kept secret. But that's supposed to be rather limited, and it gets very widely abused. So the issues can run from just even getting a response to particular types of records. Last thing I'll say, I'm going to focus on police because it really is some of the worst of it. there was just a report from the Inspector General. It was more about civil and criminal discovery than it was about FOIA, but it just confirmed that the police department really does not have a good system for keeping track of its own records. And time again, what I find is, especially if you're asking for older records from closed investigations, they have different sets of record keeping, and they try to get away with turning over a very small set of records. And time again, we find when we file lawsuits, a whole lot more records turn up. So I would pick on police records.
All right, Sam, I'm going to turn that question over to you of what types of records have been the most difficult for you to access.
I mean, Matt's correct that far and away, law enforcement is the most difficult. Chicago law enforcement, I think largely thanks to Matt and his team, has gotten a lot better. In the last few years, it's not to say it's easy, but the video release policy, like Matt said, has been big, although there was a case from 2019 where basically the city had claimed it had produced all of the videos from the shooting of Faith Augustus in South Shore, and we didn't disclose until like months later, after we had found reference to a video that they hadn't published in a report that they actually had not put all the videos forward. And I think Matt brought a motion for sanctions against them. I'm not sure if that happened, but so I think law enforcement, I think also the Park District has been one of the more difficult entities to work with in terms of records requests. They just seem to really abuse a lot of the exemptions, and I think, like a lot of other agencies, rely on the fact that most people don't fight them because it's difficult to. It's not an easy process. Outside of FOIA, I think the fact that there hasn't been, as you said, like a set municipal archive has made it very, very difficult for me when I was researching the history of law enforcement oversight in Chicago. There were periods where there was a lot of information because particular organizations' papers were available, but they only went up to a certain date, and there are just huge gaps where information is just not available. So it's not really like a category of information, but those gaps where, for whatever reason, like a particular mayor's records are not available or something along those lines, that's been the most frustrating for me.
Thank you. Joshua.
Yeah, I can really relate to what Sam was saying about kind of a view of the whole. When I came to Northeastern and was hired as their urban historian, I was very happy to be coming to the Ronald Williams Library, where they house an IRAD, an Illinois Regional Archive depository that has, among other things, the unpublished papers of the Chicago City Council from the 1830s to about World War II. And I was so excited because I used that collection to write my dissertation. It's such a rich and, I think, underutilized collection. And one of the big questions I had when I came was really, how does that collection fit with the larger landscape of records in Chicago? As Sam mentioned, there's no single municipal archive. And so I really wanted to sort of do some more work to figure out, what IRAD had and how it fit with what was at other repositories. So it's sort of a sense of trying to get a view of the whole landscape of records.
Thank you. Ed?
Yeah, well, a year ago, I would have said that Chicago City Court records and records, historic records related to the judiciary, were the most difficult for us to access, or at least to map the landscape of. But thanks to Emiliano's work this summer, we actually have really made that pretty clear. And so at this point, I think in terms of the scope of our guide, mapping out the landscape of historic city government records, we are thinking about some sort of future frontiers, like maybe suburbs, or in particular, areas that were incorporated into the city, like Lakeview Township or Hyde Park Township. In many cases, we know where those historic records exist, but we haven't yet sort of undertaken a systematic mapping of them, which areas were incorporated in the city and exactly where are the records for each of those. And so maybe not the most pressing topic in people's minds, but that is something we're thinking about just to flesh out the scope of the guide.
Thank you. Lakedria?
I definitely agree with Matt and Sam on trying to get access to police records. I found that even when it's simply just asking questions about what's available or why the numbers may not add up or why they're drastically different, compared to previous data sets that I've gotten, sometimes it can be really, really difficult to get an answer, which then makes interpreting whatever records they're giving you really difficult and sometimes impossible. So you can't even really piece together what's happening. I've also found that asking for records when it could be really politically sensitive for the organization, either it's a re-election or the budget's on the line, that it can be more difficult, and magically the records I want suddenly don't exist anymore. So that's been a challenge. And it's just separate from all of that, getting access to health data in real time has been difficult. Sometimes that data is just not kept by the city, or it is kept, but it's not accessible to the public. So I've had to sort of, try to get at that in a different way. And an example is last year, I did a story about an uptick in suicides among Black residents in the city. And the way I was able to report that story was not using real-time data that would have given a much more bigger picture as to what was happening during that time, especially during the early days of the pandemic, but I used medical examiner data that's kept by the county. And so, yeah, sometimes it is really difficult, especially when what you're reporting on or looking into can be really urgent.
Thank you. And Emiliano?
Yeah, I would still say the courts a little bit. I had definitely had trouble navigating through those during my internship, especially just navigating through, I think most of our weekly meetings, I would come to the meetings and say, yeah, I called Cook County Circuit Court, no one answered, or, they told me to call back and no one answered, and kind of just this endless game of, I'd say phone tag, but I think that relies on the other person to tag back. So sort of navigating that became an issue. And then even thinking, I believe Sam brought up, like Sam and Matt now have, that there's no centralized location. So even going to places like, I had an instance where I went to Harold Washington Library that housed a lot of these annual reports for the old municipal court. I would have numbers, the corresponding numbers and request to the librarian, like, hey, can you pull these from the back room for me? And they would come back, and every now and then, like, we can't find this one. So it becomes now like this question, is this now lost forever? Was this misshelved? And I know it'll eventually turn up down the road, just not right now when I need it. So I still think like those broader, those two, yeah, the courts, and then this sort of, I don't know how I would describe it, but lottery you play, almost trying to look through some of the more archival holdings of older records. Yeah.
I can assure you that it also gives us librarians and archivists a tiny heart attack every time something's not on the shelf where it's supposed to be. It's not fun for any of us, I promise. So a couple of you have started to allude to this, and Lakedria, I was going to start with you anyway, and I know you've started to mention this, but what advice would you give to others getting started when they're looking for municipal records? Or alternately, like, what do you wish you had known when you'd started this research?
I think my biggest advice would be to just pick up the phone and call someone and start just having a conversation about what records you need. I think that can be really scary, especially if you're not used to doing that. But I think through talking to people, you can get a better understanding of what's available instead of just sort of going to search for yourself and, you know, not really finding whatever it is that you need. In terms of like reporting, I find that requesting, which is what I do more often now, is requesting an organization's retention schedule to see all of the records that they keep and how often is really helpful. So I'm just not starting from scratch. And then what I also like to do is go through and read annual reports going back decades for organizations. They usually publish this on their websites, depending on what city agency it is. And you can just learn a lot about what's happened over the years, through the decades, with what's in there.
Thank you. Josh, I will punt that question to you.
Thank you. My advice really is to start, for at least for a historical researcher, would be to start with the guide that Ed and Emiliano and I have created, because it's essentially born out of me confronting this question of where to go and where to find municipal government records. And it was really animated by a couple really simple questions. What exists and where is it? And how do I find it and how do I use it? And our guide is really, our attempt to answer those seemingly straightforward questions. In so doing, and so trying to answer those questions, we've really enlisted the help and expertise of many really wonderful archivists from across Chicago. So I think that you'll find on the guide not just the wisdom we've acquired in trying to answer that question for ourselves, but you'll also see area archivists interviewed about the strengths of their particular collections. So it goes just beyond what we've learned.
Great. And just to let everyone know that Ed, Josh, and Emiliano will be presenting their guide as part of this session. So you will get to see that too. But for now, I'm going to ask Emiliano what advice you would give to others who are starting to look for municipal records.
Absolutely. So when I had to begin this internship and navigate the city courts in Chicago, which was very much unfamiliar territory for me, I began with mining footnotes. So I was given some great book recommendations before I started the internship and mined those footnotes, as well as then there's been some great recent reporting and data-driven work done about Cook County Circuit Court. One of the sort of bits that I relied on was the circuit, which was a byproduct from like Better Government Association, Chicago Reporter, and Injustice Watch, I believe was the third group. And they looked at the Cook County Court for like the past 3 decades and really using that and kind of like then just taking it back further and trying to, as a historian now, I was interested in the entirety of the history of the courts in the city, try and, fill in the gap between start of Chicago through now, where the circuit project began. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Ed?
Yeah, well, I would actually echo for historical research, something that Lakedria mentioned about present day research, which is be attentive to whether you might be able to find something in county government that relates to the city and vice versa. Certainly historically, that's one of the challenges that we had to wrap our minds around, that certain institutions like courts or hospitals or other institutions of urban governance would sort of shift in jurisdiction at times historically between city and county. So just be aware of that and be aware of how data or records of one type could potentially illuminate the other side of that divide. And then I guess my other piece of advice is simply ask a librarian, and ask a librarian if they know other librarians, and keep following that trail of librarian referrals, because that's the only way that we were able to bring all of this information together. And whether you're a junior high school researcher or a PhD researcher, I think that's still a great tip.
Thank you. I appreciate the the librarian shout out also. Matt?
So, I mean, I'm coming at it from the perspective of getting access to records under FOIA. I think a common mistake people make is thinking that they have to take no for an answer, and that there's nothing you can do. And if the request gets denied, or they said they couldn't find any records, that there's nothing more you can do. Because there's two things. Well, there's more than two, but there are two things I'll focus on that you can do. You can ask the Attorney General to review the denial, and that is relatively simple process. I think their website is running again at the AG's office after the malware, but it's not hard to find the instructions on how to do that. It takes just a couple minutes of time to do, but you have to do it within 60 days of the denial. So I often tell people on day 59, you might as well submit a request for review. But often that takes like a really, really long time, like months or even years sometimes. And it often ends in a non-binding decision, which means that if the government agency doesn't want to do what the Attorney General says they're supposed to do, you don't have any remedy really other than shame. You're just sort of back to where you started. So your other option is the law says that if you can go to court to challenge a denial, you don't have to know that you're right. I mean, we have a lot of cases where, we strongly suspect there's more records, but until we get into the case, we won't really know that definitively. The government bears the burden of proving a reasonable search, and it bears the burden of proving that any asserted exemptions actually apply to the records. So you start with a huge thumb on the scale, and then you add to that the fact that the statute provides that if you prevail, the city or the whatever government entity has to pay your legal fees. So a misconception is, I can't afford to hire a lawyer. And the statute has addressed that, recognizing that not many people are going to spend tens of thousands of dollars out of their own pocket to fight for records. So there's a way that you can do that and it need not cost anything. So I think, people sort of thinking that a denial is the end of the road is a common mistake.
Thank you. And Sam, I'll posit that question to you too.
Sure. I think a lot of people, when they are first, and this is either, I guess, archival research or FOIA requests, have a topic rather than a specific thing that they're seeking. And that's not a bad thing, but especially with a FOIA request, more often than not, if you have a FOIA request that's for a topic rather than for specific records, it'll be fairly easy for them to blow you off. So with FOIA requests, I think a great place to always start is with the policies of the organization, the written rules or the ordinance that created the body, or if there's an audit report or something like that, that kind of just describes the process that you're interested in, I think will just give you a wealth of jumping off points. I guess on that same note, I think you should over FOIA. If you think like any government body has touched something that you're interested in, you should ask them for everything they have, because you don't know what they have. It could be the same as what the other public bodies have that you're interested in, but it could also either maybe they held on to something longer than another body because of different retention policies or for whatever reason. Worst case scenario is you get duplicates of records that you already got. So that's been something that's been really helpful for me, is to just find everything you can possibly ask for and ask for it. And then I would echo Matt and just know what the denials actually say, which doesn't mean that you need to be an expert. Just go and compare what's in the denial letter to what's in the law. And if you're like, this doesn't match up, then the PAC can be useful. It has a lot of issues, especially with timeliness. But I think one of the things that's really good is if you make a good argument to the PAC and they send that to the public body, sometimes the fact that the PAC is looking into something is enough to get them to back off. Or a letter from someone like Matt is enough to get them to back off without any actual enforcement. So just knowing the ground that you're playing on with them, because they can make something sound really scary in legalese and it can just be absolutely nothing.
Thank you. And could you remind us one more time what PAC stands for?
Yes, sorry. The PAC is the Public Access Counselor, which is the office within the Attorney General's office that will handle a FOIA denial appeal.
Awesome. Thank you. So my next question for folks is very related to this one. It's what resources or processes do you have that have made this easier? A lot of you have started to address this already. So I'm going to start this part with the NEIU folks, and they can share their screen. All of you should be able to do that, so they can share their guide, and then Sam, Matt, and Lakedria, if you'd be thinking if there's any other resources, we'll come back to you all after this short demonstration.
Yeah, so I will share my screen and give everyone a little tour of our guide, just recently made public. So there may be a few small errors, but I think it should be mostly fit for public viewing. So on our homepage, we describe the purposes of our guide to help researchers locate and access Chicago City government records, historic records, both online and in brick and mortar archives throughout the city and beyond. So I'm going to focus on our 3 original pages. We expanded the guide out a little bit, but we started with these 3 pages: departments and agencies, city council, and city officials, and then we added some others over time. So first, on our departments and agencies page, you can find a genealogy of city departments. This is through the Harold Washington Library's Municipal Reference Desk. We offer in digital format a historical list of city department heads, which can be really useful. One thing that I should point out is that researchers often start being interested in a particular city department or in an area of urban governance that is in some way managed or intervened in through a specific department. And so this can be a good starting point, right? Just to understand which departments have existed over time. And for that, the Harold Washington Library also offers a list of the departments that they have records for at their location. But of course, not everything is limited to the Harold Washington Library. One can also search for in Archie, the Chicago History Museum's catalog to see if they have records pertaining to a particular department. And then of course, some reports, historic reports, have been digitized and can be found via Google Books or HathiTrust. Much is available obviously via the Chicago Collections Consortium. Now, research in a particular department or area of city governance may take one to the city council. And so here we offer some resources that can help navigate the landscape of historic records related to the city's legislative branch through, I believe this was the Harold Washington Library. Also, we have a list, yes, a list of Chicago aldermen by ward, historic list. Some of this information can be quite difficult to track down. And so we tried to just sort of put it front and center here to give people some starting points. Also, this is very important, Chicago City Council Committee genealogy. My understanding is this is a potentially incomplete list, but still a wonderful starting point to know which city committees existed, city council committees existed at what times. Then this page proceeds to discuss the published proceedings of the Chicago City Council, which are located at the Municipal Reference Collection at the Harold Washington Library, as well as the unpublished Chicago City Council proceedings files, which, as you see here in this paragraph, contain a lot of very specific types of documents that would be of much relevance to historians. And then we also mention here some other ways that you can access these documents. Essentially, the Chicago City Council proceedings files are the files and any documentation that was brought before the City Council as it conducted business. And we are actually in the process of digitizing the Chicago City Council proceedings files indexed so that folks will be able to access that digitally. Digital copies have been made, but we're currently uploading them to our digital commons. I realized that I forgot to give you all the website, so my apologies for that. I'm not sure if you had it before, but I'm going to go ahead and just paste that in the chat quickly. Oh, this is going to panelists, so everyone can sort of follow along. Okay, and then the final of the 3 initial pages that we started with is the city officials page. And here we have a very helpful centennial list of mayors, city clerks, city attorneys, city treasurers, and aldermen from 1837 to 1937. It's a big PDF, but you can see that we offer both PDF and HTML here. And that's probably one of the richest documents in this section. Also, again, the department heads list and list of aldermen by ward. We also offer some advice on finding records about city officials, and this is fairly straightforward. It's typically a matter of searching for their name in relevant websites and archives like the Chicago Collections Consortium, and potentially also using Archive Grid to see if there may be records for city officials who relocated away from the city, and maybe their records could be stored in another city or state. So with that, I will continue to share my screen, and I'll pass the mic over to Emiliano, who will talk about the courts page.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah. So with the courts page, the first general bit was really to give a chronological overview of how the court system has changed in the city of Chicago. I think that's was one of the greater challenges I had, considering that, right, like that Chicago is now only grown in size, but the sort of governance structure itself, and really giving this overview up until I think one of the main turning points being the Municipal Court of Chicago Act. So where possible, hyperlinking in, yeah, you can click in if you'd like, please, hyperlinking in the actual sources so that people have an understanding then of how these systems of power were structured, mainly by the legislature for the state of Illinois. And then I note then the sort of slew, because the Municipal Court of Chicago Act let chief justices establish courts for all sort of things, right? So the slew of different courts that I found: morals courts, boys courts, speeders courts, so sort of like a traffic court. And these all were built at the discretion of or established at the discretion of the chief justice, and created, I think, not only as like a researcher, but I can imagine back then a very all-encompassing mess of a network of legal proceedings. So then giving the idea of that in the 1960s, these conversations coming about that the court structure needs to change, and kind of walk through on how these conversations establish sort of the structure we see today, are hyperlinked into Cook County Circuit Court structure presently, just to give people an idea of now sort of the, I believe it's all the way at the bottom, their organization chart on this page. Yeah. So just, it's a lot neater than what it was, being the main point of this bit here. Yeah, close, please. And then sort of the finding the records. I think that was one of the things I underestimated before beginning my graduate studies, is just how far apart some of these archival holdings or these records are. And I can only imagine, you know, without something like this guide, looking for something going from UIC to Hyde Park to the Loop to Harold Washington to Chicago History Museum, and still maybe not finding what I was looking for, just because there is no centralized location for these documents. And so, using then this section about finding records on the city courts to note some of these. Although not that far away, one of the instances of someone moving out of Chicago and their records being somewhere else was Judge Harry Olson, whose papers are at Northwestern. Gilbert, who's included in here, some of his documents are at his alma mater. I am blanking, I can't remember if it was Yale or Stanford. So for example, there's then this whole a whole mess of records about the Chicago courts that are nowhere, not even located in Illinois. And then really trying to note what digitized materials there are, giving a sense very generally, I did eventually get that phone call back of what kind of materials are in the archives department at Cook County Circuit Court. There's quite a bit though still to be added on to this. I feel like there's whoever comes after me will still have quite a bit to do. Thank you.
And Josh?
Yeah, the part of the guide, I'd like to highlight 3 parts of the guide very quickly. Ed, if you would click on archives for us, please. One of the things we did in this guide was we had the opportunity to go visit repositories around Chicago that hold many different Chicago city government documents. And we interviewed the archivists who work with those documents. And we created 2 sets of videos from those interviews. One set is a set of short videos that are about 2 to 4 minutes in length that are really aimed at, say, a high school researcher, maybe someone working with Chicago Metro History Fair, or perhaps an undergraduate researcher. And the purpose of those shorter videos are to give those researchers a sense of both what kind of documents various repositories have. So we did the Municipal Reference Collection at Harold Washington Public Library. We went to special collections at UIC. We went to the Chicago History Museum, and we interviewed archivists in IRAD at Northeastern Illinois University. And our goal was to give people a sense of what those collections have, but also, especially for the student researchers, a sense of how to begin using archives and archival collections. We were thinking that you know, a lot of student researchers might be somewhat intimidated by the you know, process and the act of going to an archive, many for the first time, and we wanted to demystify that. So that's what those shorter videos aim to do. The longer videos are aimed more at seasoned researchers, and they run about an hour in length. And what they are aimed at doing is really kind of capturing some of the archivist's expertise and preserving it and imparting it for researchers. In particular, we asked a lot of questions about the strengths of their collections, and we also asked archivists to talk about aspects of their collections that they believe were underutilized, with an eye toward you know, harnessing their wisdom and letting them sort of guide and point researchers to things that might be of interest that maybe have been missed or underutilized by scholars. So those are the videos we have. Then there are 2 other sections of the guide I'd like to point you to. The first is a bibliography of studies of Chicago. One of the things we noted in the intro to the guide is that Chicago is one of the most studied cities in North America. And we wanted to point our users to the rich scholarship that is available on topics in Chicago history. And so we didn't make an exhaustive bibliography, but we made a bibliography that I think represents scholarship from the past 2 decades that really speaks to the signal events in Chicago's history and the signal issues in Chicago history. So I think whether you're looking at race and policing or environmental history or the history of parks or business and technology, any topic, you can find sort of a literature that will get you started on your research in that area using this bibliography. Then we have a much more specialized bibliography here at the end called a Bibliography of Chicago City Government Structure. One of the things that quickly stood out to us as we were working on this project of trying to answer those questions, what exists and where is it, is that trying to figure out what exists demanded that we ask the question, what was the structure of city government at different points in the city's history and how had that structure changed. And this bibliography really represents a small number of works that really point, I think, researchers to answers to that question of how was city government structured at various points in history and how did that structure change over time? And so these works, I think, will allow you to kind of understand how the power structures have changed over time. Thank you, Ed. I think that concludes sort of a brief intro to our guide.
Thank you all so much for sharing. I am so thrilled that this is live. I will be referring so many people. Your viewing numbers will go up in large part thanks to me, but I'm sure thanks to many of our attendees tonight too. And I mentioned in the chat, but we will make sure in the notes accompanying the published video to include the links we've talked about tonight. So those will be in there as well. So I wanted to check in with Sam, Matt, and Lakedria to see if they had anything else they wanted to share about resources that they like. We are getting a little bit close to 7, so I want to make sure we have enough time because we've got several audience questions, but I didn't want to leave you all out of the resource fund. So okay, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. I mean, it's nowhere near as comprehensive, but to take it into sort of the modern day, using FOIA to get records, there are a number of resources within the statute that are very helpful. I mean, typically, FOIA doesn't say anything about having to create records. It's just about access to existing records. But there's a few provisions that are really helpful, and it would be really cool if somebody made a comprehensive compilation of this across every public body in Illinois. So one is that the entity, the public body, has to provide on its website and in its offices a brief description of itself, including what its purpose is, functional subdivisions, operating budget, and things like that. And sometimes that seems sort of, well, it's the city of Chicago, we know what it is, but Illinois has, like, per capita, by far the most number of units of government. We have mosquito abatement districts and all kinds of like hyper tiny little units of government, and sometimes you have no idea what they are. So that can be really useful. And then similarly, every public body is supposed to publish on its website and in its offices a list of all the categories of records under its control, which can be really useful. Unfortunately, those are often like very generic, and I think it's an area that we could do better about holding public bodies accountable and making sure they're complying with that, because to have a broader view of the sense of all the kinds of records that are kept, I mean, it's sort of like it's for current records, it's sort of comparable to having a clearinghouse of like, this is all the historic stuff. So those are some resources people often don't realize they could take advantage of.
Thank you. Sam or Lakedria, anything you wanted to add?
Nothing to add, but that was amazing. I wish I organized everything that I've gotten from the city in that way. I just tend to keep it all in my head, which is not the most helpful.
Yeah, just really impressive guide that I'm very excited to use. 2 things that I guess have been helpful for me. The Chicago Collections website, which, if you're not aware, aggregates the collections of a lot of different special collections, like Chicago History Museum or UIC or UChicago. I'm sure I'm missing like 10, but that's been super helpful for me. And also, when I've been frustrated by not being able to find actual primary source records of what I'm looking for, newspaper archives are incredibly useful. There were way more reporters previous to now producing way more journalism, and some of it was very bad and of its time, but a lot of it is useful, and if nothing else, can help you gain an understanding of what the systems were. So newspaper archives, and then at Chicago History Museum, and I believe at a collection at UIC, there are copies of the Chicago Journalism Review, which was an outlet that lasted like 6 years maybe, but it was a place where a lot of reporters for the more major outlets were able to publish things that were politically sensitive or that were criticisms of the media. So I think a really famous example is they had a whole issue about the Chicago Tribune's incorrect reporting about the killing of Fred Hampton, and how that happened, and how the Tribune ran, lies that nail heads were bullet holes. So those have been very useful for me.
Thank you, everybody. I have one sort of lightning round question for folks before we go to audience questions. So I want your answers, but I also want them to be pretty brief. Where do you hope the future of municipal records in Chicago is headed? What would be like your one wish? And I will start with Ed.
I don't have a big picture view, but we are putting the Chicago City Council Proceedings Files Index on our digital commons, and I wish for that to be completed as soon as possible. I'm trying to make that happen.
Awesome. Thank you. Emiliano.
Yeah, I think some conversations need to happen on just sort of like how records are preserved today. I know there's been quite a bit that, during this post-pandemic that I could go turn on Facebook and watch council meeting minute, but then still like that adds questions now about like access and equitable. There's still neighborhoods that are 20 to 40% without internet access. So these are like conversations that need to still happen.
Sam.
It'd be great if the city could start taking a more active role in all of this. There are lots of resources that are kind of spread disparately, like the Chicago Guide and like Invisible Institute's CPDP, and those are great that private organizations are maintaining those, but it really should be within the city's interest to make all of this information as accessible as it can be.
Matt?
I mean, I'm looking forward to a day when AI and other sort of fancy computer stuff like that can be used to just make it dramatically faster to get access to records, and even predictively sort of but recommend whether things might be exempt. I think the whole process could be made just tremendously easier than what is now a very clunky, largely manual system.
Kedra?
I think just more transparency on how records are kept and maintained, and also access, I think, will continue to be a big issue. And, I don't think people should have to learn about municipal records through trial and error, and, just making it accessible goes a long way.
Thank you. And Joshua?
Well, I think my wish would be something like a municipal archive, which the city had until 1992 and closed down in a round of budget cuts. And I would love to see an institution like that again.
And I want to clarify for folks, and others may know even more about this than I do, so feel free to put that in the chat if you would like to. There's a really good reader article, though, from when the Municipal Archive moved from the city's kind of being within City Hall to the Harold Washington Library Center. And I highly recommend seeking out that reader article. It's really good. It sounds like it was written yesterday, and I believe it's from 1992. But it talks
actually, may I add that it's linked on our guide?
Oh, perfect.
On our first page.
That's probably where I first read it, actually, when I was an early reviewer. But it goes a little bit into the difference between, or into what that library collected, which I believe was mostly the published materials that came out of the city of Chicago, in addition to some other materials, but they weren't necessarily keeping, the mayor's agenda for every term, or the things that we think of as a little bit more like kind of behind the scenes archives and records. And thanks, Ed, for putting that into the chat. So I'm going to move over to our questions in the Q&A. And our first one is from Tim. And they asked, have any of you found it common that some government officials seem to confuse deliberation of process or even executive privilege with attorney-client privilege and/or attorney work product, even if the issues in the email didn't involve legal advice, but was more policy deliberations instead? And these seem to come up in matters with the most incriminating evidence, leading the officials to claim attorney-client privilege when it was a possible abuse of deliberation of process.
Well, that's a series of questions. There are a number of legal bases by which public bodies can withhold records, and there's this sort of cluster of deliberative process is what any government officials, doesn't have to be lawyers, are deliberating about matters of policy. The idea being we don't want them to have to deliberate in a fishbowl, and that they won't be forthcoming if they know their initial opinions might later be subject to scrutiny. There is a lot of criticism of the validity of that way of thinking, but that is what it is. Attorney-client privilege is literally like the seeking of and provision of legal advice. So that might be, the mayor emailing the corporation counsel asking for an answer to a legal question. Attorney work product is not a communication with a client, but an attorney's own notes or summaries or things like that that are created in anticipation of litigation. So they all kind of, a lot of times they would overlap. Let me just go back to for the other parts of the question. I think what the question is getting at is that these things get overused and abused, and that's very true. Just one kind of clear example would be the mere fact that a lawyer is involved in a communication does not necessarily make it privileged. It may not be legal advice. It might be political discussions. What are the political ramifications of this decision? That's not legal advice, but that gets overused all the time.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on this question? Okay. I have a question from Dave for Sam. What would be, so this is from an early comment you made where I believe you mentioned there were notable gaps in records. So what would be another example of notable types of gaps in city records aside from, say, an entire mayor's term?
I don't know that I've necessarily come across anything that's directly comparable. I think maybe another example would be there have been city departments that have been created and merged and split and shut down and then restarted over the years, and being able to trace that is quite difficult. I'm sure that the NEIU people can talk more about that, but there was the City Department of Housing, and then it was Planning and Development, and now there's a Department of Housing, and there was a Department of Environment that Lori Lightfoot said she was starting in. And so just being able to know where housing policy was in the first housing department, I wouldn't even necessarily know how to find that. So I think that's another argument for a municipal archive.
Thank you. And if anybody else would like to answer that question too, feel free.
I would add appointed officials within city government. So some of the records that, not just because of time, but the Justice of Peace records. Those Justice of Peaces were appointed by the governor. You just had to be 25. You didn't need legal experience. I could have been a bartender in Pilsen that the governor liked, would appointed. I wouldn't have an office. I would have, more often than not, the Justice of Peace use their places of business as their office. So we're then talking about where do I put these records when I'm no longer Justice of Peace? Do I have even a filing system? But there's modern day parallels. I'm thinking Micah Miscuel wrote a really neat article recently about a machine in the barrio talking about Latinos, primarily Mexican Americans, that Mayor Daley appointed and served as sort of his negotiators, brokers within primarily ethnic Mexican neighborhoods in the city. What they might have done, and that's part of what he talks, even trying to tease out what did these people who essentially worked for Mayor Daley do in these neighborhoods. There's no paper trail going back, or not going back, but talking about this from the 60s or 70s. Yeah, so I would add that.
Really quick to add to that, aldermen are not subject to FOIA. And so I think that's a huge black hole as well as the papers of aldermen. I'm not sure if any of have donated their papers to a collection, but they're certainly not required to. And you can get city council committee records, but it's very difficult to get records from an aldermanic office.
I'll just add that's an area that is just calling out to be litigated to some extent, because the way that FOIA has been interpreted, and fairly the way it's been written, is because individual legislators can't transact public business on their own, that their records don't pertain to public business. Now, anyone who lives in a ward in the city of Chicago knows there's a whole lot that the alder person does that it is not legislative at all. I mean, it's their fiefdom, and that has not really been addressed in court, and it should be.
All right, thank you, everybody. So I have a slightly longer question from Heather. So working with the USA COE, which I'm not 100% sure what that stands for. So Heather, if you want to put that in the chat, feel free, or others may know. The Chicago Park District created the Shoreline Protection Project with a $500 million budget. This was to include the South Side lakefront as well, but they spent all the funding north of 31st, including a theater at Fullerton. I don't know where to go to get the planned budget and then the spending tracking. I know the Department of Cultural Affairs was cited and the newish Department of Tourism. I also suspect there was public-private funding. I want to get the records of the spending. I didn't realize until until Matt was presenting that the email may be FOIA-able, and she is looking for any direction that you all may have for her. She does specify that she FOIA'd the historic preservationist folks, and they returned the request pretty quickly. U.S. Army Corps of Engineer. Thank you, Heather.
I'm happy to go ahead, Sam. You know, the art of how to make FOIA requests is a whole other discussion. It would take a long time. So, but I would say generally things that relate to the use of public funds are like pretty much always subject to disclosure. The question is like, what kind of records will they have? And one place that I find to be useful to start is imagine that in a well-run government, isn't that something that somebody would write a memo about or a report about, right? If there's going to be $500 million in spending, assume that there's a budget that was written and somebody did something to keep track of that. And you can kind of start there and then see what happens. Sometimes you have to go in the opposite direction though, and just, you can ask for emails and specify the search terms you want used and just have them search, and you can start to back into it. Last thing I would say is sometimes it takes many, many rounds. Lakedria, you probably could, from FOIAing as a journalist, could probably speak to this quite a bit, that like you think you know a little bit and you make some FOIAs and then you get records and you learn more. And then, oh, okay, there's a 952 report that's supposed to be filled out every time this happens. So I want the archive of 952 reports. So, sometimes going at it multiple times can be helpful.
Yeah, I would just echo what I said earlier about FOIAing everyone you can. So like one agency that's involved in this protection project is the State Department of Natural Resources. I'm sure a lot of things go through them that maybe they didn't create, but they can release through FOIA. And maybe they're easier to work with than the Park District. It's a pretty low bar, but I would just try everywhere that you can. And, if you describe, I want a document that sets out what the budget is, and then a document that sets out what the spending was. Those are relatively standard government records that they arguably should be able to find. And if they're saying they can't, then that might be an appeal.
Great, thank you, everybody. We have a question from Linda, whether she's wondering what your impressions are of the Chicago data portal. Is it useful to researchers or does it leave a lot out?
It leaves a huge amount out, I feel. And you don't know unless you know what you're looking for, or you FOIA'd similar data and you've seen all of the fields and options that are often not immediately available to the public. I was actually quite shocked when I realized that. I think it's good for like any type of preliminary analysis or just to see what's there. But I think, you know, doing a FOIA request and just asking for like, you know, their data, you know, coding and how they determine everything is helpful just to see what's there. It's really, depending on what data you're looking at from that portal, it's just not very reflective of everything that they keep.
Just to echo that, there is so much information that they will choose not to post, and it's frequently a political calculation. I'm gonna put that out there. So one big example is Invisible Institute maintains our own database of Chicago police misconduct complaints. The city in the last couple of years has posted data to the data portal that does show a lot of information. Most notably, it does not give you the officer's name. It will break down information about the officer's gender, sex, whatever, but it's not possible, I don't think, to be able to trace an individual officer's misconduct, and there's nothing preventing them from releasing that information. That's a decision that they're making. So it's, like Lakedria said, really good for knowing some basics around information, but I would follow it up with a request.
Okay, and then we have another question from Linda. Are there any cities that are great examples of municipal document or record repositories? I'm seeing a lot of skeptical faces. I guess I would amend the question of, even maybe if not for the entire municipal government, are there any examples of accessible parts of governments or other cities or departments that you have admired? Still seeing a lot of skeptical faces. Well, if anybody does think of any, we can circle back to that question. But I'm going to say for now, it seems like no. And Linda, I can try to tackle this question, but others feel free. I mentioned before, so our question was, can you explain the difference between municipal records and municipal documents? And I think I have used those a little bit interchangeably tonight. So I think of municipal documents as being ones that are published by the government. And as I mentioned, generally, if something is published for the public by the city government, that has been accessible. So generally through the municipal reference library, but often copies are sent to places like IRAD, Chicago History Museum, you know, these big repositories, we will collect them. When I think of municipal records, I'm often thinking of that in terms of personal papers or organizational papers that detail the kind of more private nature of government archives. So those would be things like someone's schedule, meeting minutes of a private meeting. I'm sure there's a million other examples out there, private correspondence, that sort of thing. But if others have thoughts about those distinctions, I'm all ears. I will say now also, I think we're introducing municipal data into this equation, which is not something that we have all dealt with a lot. So that's what I think is really a strength of the Inspector General's office and some of these other places where there's aggregate data, as many of the panelists were mentioning, that's a little bit different also from records and documents. Okay. And I'm also happy to address the question why the city clerk isn't on this panel. And that's basically because this is our first foray, and we went through our personal connections and our professional connections, and mostly through Chicago area archivists planning this, and none of us had a line to the city clerk. So they would certainly be somebody we would want to include in the future panel. And quite frankly, also, you know, one of the future topics I would be interested in is also hearing from someone who does work at the Office of the Inspector General, or another type of data portal. The Cook County has a really robust data portal. So hearing from some of those folks as well. Okay. And then we have a question from Robert. I answered in the chat a little bit, but I wanted to see if any of the other panelists had any knowledge about this. So the question, I love seeing the old city records on sites like HathiTrust. If anyone is not aware, HathiTrust publishes full text of public domain materials. It's really great if you're looking for something in the public domain. But most of them cut off in the 1920s, apparently because later documents are copyrighted. It seems to me that the city should decree all of those documents as being in the public domain so they can be posted online for everyone to read. Do any of you know about this issue? So my contribution is that as far as I understand, only federal government documents have to be public domain. City and state and other entities can choose to release their documents as public domain, or they cannot. As far as I know, mostly Chicago does not. But I wanted to know if you all have run into any advocacy for the city to release into public domain or anything else along those lines.
I don't have a specific answer to this, but there was a time when I was going through the Harold Washington papers at the library, and I started to take pictures of the report that I was going through, and the librarian came over and stopped me and said, this is a copyrighted manuscript, I think. I said, this is a city record, like it would be subject to FOIA if I asked for it during this time, you know, why can't I go through it? And I ended up having to like write a letter explaining that it's a public record and it would have been requestable as a FOIA request if it wasn't housed in this archive. It was just a city document. So individually that's worked as like an argument. That doesn't answer the question of like decades of, you know, papers not being available, but maybe Matt can speak more about the interplay between public records and copyright, but making that argument's been successful for me.
We could do an hour-and-a-half session on the intersection between copyright law and open records laws. You know, one way I've seen court, Illinois, I don't think has really wrestled this to the ground. Some courts have said to sort of get around the issue, to say that their open record law at least gives you a right to view the records. But if it's copyrighted, the government can allow you to view it, but not actually make copies of it. I mean, the whole idea of government copywriting is just appalling to me. But it is a function of state law and how states want to handle it. And very, very often, I mean, if you're not collecting the records to turn around and sell them, or otherwise, you know, kind of make the whole idea, there's fair use, right? Which some people might know. Now I'm gonna, don't get me going, I'll talk forever. But that not all copyright infringement is actually copyright infringement. Sometimes you actually do have a right to information. And the fundamental question is like, are you taking a market away from somebody who might be able to sell this material? And a lot of instances, government records like that, it would be unlikely to be the case. So it's a very thorny question, and the easiest fix is just the city of Chicago should say we waive all of our copyright and everything.
Someone who would love never to have to deal with copyright restrictions ever again, I'd be very into that. But I realize I'm I'm on one very specific side of that equation. So we have a question from Grace in the chat that was partially answered by Ed, but I wanted to pose it to everyone. They said, I work at the Newberry Library, and one question that comes up is records from Municipal Tuberculosis Sanitarium. Has anyone run across those records? And then later they specified looking specifically for patient records.
Yeah, I mean, my first cut into that was to look at the list of departments and agencies whose records are at the Harold Washington Library Center. And so the Municipal Tuberculosis Sanitarium does have records there, but right, maybe not patient records. My only other thought other than HathiTrust or Internet Archive, was to very indirectly get at, some sense of the patient records by looking at potentially medical journal articles published at that time on the basis of research conducted at the sanitarium. But obviously that's extremely indirect. So I really don't have a direct answer offhand.
And Grace, you'll know this from working at the Newberry, but for others out there, I will also say that often patient records just are very difficult to find at almost every repository I've worked at. When we have gotten a donation from some kind of medical body, they have destroyed the patient records before gifting the materials. For privacy reasons, I don't know that I feel like that's a completely bad decision, but I certainly understand a lot of folks, especially if a significant amount of time has passed, are looking for those records. This comes up for me, particularly in the cases of adoption, and I know the Newberry has several amazing resources because those records can certainly be very difficult to track. All right, so I think we made it through all of our questions in the Q&A in the chat. I will do one more lightning round of my pet question. So just a one sentence answer for this, which is, why do you think Chicago is like this? And I know it's not just Chicago, but why do you think this happens? So I will start with Ed.
I guess I'd have to say politics.
All right. Emiliano?
That's a tough one. I'd go with like size, the sheer size of it. Yeah.
Matt?
Yeah, I think we kind of let them get away with it when we vote.
Lakedria?
Oh my God, I don't even know how to answer. I don't know, politics, power, inequality, people really not having a voice. I think if people had a say, obviously things would be better.
Josh?
Echoing Ed, would say it's about the protection of political power.
And Sam?
Yeah, I would echo what pretty much everyone said and say politics. It's in your best interest to not give people evidence that they can use to change the political system if you're in power.
I think those all sound right to me. A huge thank you to all of our panelists. And thank you to Elise, who's been hanging out in the panelist squares. She is our assistant from Chicago Area Archivists who is helping funnel me your questions. And thank you to Jeannie Long from Chicago Collections for giving us this Zoom platform and for helping us record and make this accessible to you in many places. If anybody has any last words that they would like to say, I will turn it over to you all now.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thanks for putting this together.
Thank you, everybody. This will be, like I said, I'm really hoping this will be the first of many programs. Chicago Area Archivists Anti-Racism Working Group convened last summer, and one of our main points that we really wanted to work on was increasing information about how accessible Chicago city documents were or were not, and what are ways that we can push that type of accessibility forward. So I think education about what the current state is the first step. This will, like I said, we only touched the surface here. And then advocacy is really our next step there. So I think we've got lots of ways to do that, whether it's putting records into the public domain, whether it's advocating for a central location, for more robust retention schedules from city departments. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I am so excited by these panelists and the archivists and others who are attending, because I know we're all committed to this cause. All right. Thank you to everybody. And Jeannie, I wanted to check and see if you had any last words from Chicago Collections.
No, I second your thanks to every one of the panelists in this conversation tonight. I hope in our partnership with Chicago Area Archivists will continue to offer programs like this, and with the end game of making this information more accessible and available to everyone. So thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.